Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your hosts for Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. In this and upcoming episodes, we're going to be discussing questions that have come up from our conversations with educators. This week, we're going to talk about how to use restorative questions in the middle of busyness. And it's really about small changes in our language and in our questions when things get busy. And I think learning and understanding more about how to integrate restorative questions into your day-to-day work is really important because it can help you shape the conversations where you listen first and talk second. And who's not in a busy school or classroom today? So this podcast's for you. It can help you connect with students, with adults in the building, and with parents. Some of the main topics we'll be covering include changing your language and questions can definitely change your relationships with others. There's a great story from Shelley about acknowledgement when someone's talking to you, and we have some great topics for classroom meetings. At the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find some free restorative resources. And if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Now, let's head over to this discussion with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. In our work with schools and teachers and principals and superintendents around attendance, we're running into a number of questions. And so we want to deal with some of those questions. One of the big ones that has come up recently is, look, my classroom, my school is very, very busy. How do I use these restorative questions in the middle of all this busyness?
Good question. In talking to one of the teachers I was dealing with, she recognized the busyness of it and was attempting to, trying to use the restorative questions as almost become a reflex to her. So she wanted to do, the more she did, the more it would become almost second nature for her to do that. And, simply all she wanted to do was to greet kids at the door every day. And, make that was her intentional effort, was to make sure she greeted the kids at the door every day, because she recognized it does get busy when you're working, but I can at least make that contact, that initial contact. In other words, if I see a child who looks like they're maybe having a bad day already, they're usually a bubbly child, and now they've got that sort of downcast look, rather than saying, well, what's wrong or what happened this morning? It's, did something happen? Tell me what's been happening, and trying to initiate that conversation, very quick conversation. It might only be 10, 15 seconds, but just enough to let the child know that you're willing to listen and you want to make that connection, rather than just standing there going, good morning, 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 good morning. And a child's downcast and obviously having a bad day. And you say, good morning, a nice bubbly thing. And the kid moves on. Well, they're just saying good morning. They're not really interested in greeting me. So her attempt was to try and use that 5-10 second intervention with each child as they enter the room as a way to gauge the kind of day they're going to have, but also let them know that they're willing to listen to them if she does perceive that maybe things aren't going so well.
And I love when I hear that people are trying to integrate it into their current practice, because we know, and it's been my experience with training teachers in their classroom, the ones that continue to use it, whether a school remains a restorative school, the administration changes, whatever it is, those that have integrated restorative practices into their practice every day, it goes on. It's still going on, right? Teachers that I trained 10 years ago, because they've made it part of what they do. So for looking for those little opportunities, just changing my language a little bit to do the same thing I was already doing, that is what's going to stick. Right. And then, so small changes, and then you'll continue to build and build on it. And then before you know it, you do have a restorative classroom.
And I like the intention that's going with what this teacher was responding to, that I'm going to intentionally build this into my practice, and I'm going to intentionally change the way I interact with students as they come into the door. And part of what I think our work has been in terms of attendance is being intentional about those students who are missing, because we need to make sure that we're building connections with those kids, and we need to be asking questions to those kids. Now, Shelley, you had a story about something that happened with your own son in
Right.
school about listening that I thought was really
Right. Right.
appropriate.
So my approach with my children was that if they couldn't respond to me right away from another room when I was calling them or whatever, they were to at least acknowledge that they've heard me, and they would be with me in a minute, or I'm coming, or what it is, not to continue to ignore my calls, not my yelling, my calls. from another room.
Of course, it was all calls,
Exactly.
Shelley.
But so, my son is in grade 4. And as I've said before, luckily he had a very understanding teacher and one with a good sense of humor and could recognize his sense of humor at times too. She was working with another group of students in the classroom, and he was calling on her for assistance for something that they were doing in grade 4. And he kept saying her name, Mrs. Campbell, Mrs. Campbell. And she kept working with these students. Well, eventually she turned to him and said, Christopher, I'll be with you in a minute, and was probably somewhat short because he had called her about, 4 times at this point. And he said to her, would you please acknowledge me? And then he would have been good, right? But, she told me this story. So she also saw some humor in it. Also probably learned a little bit of a lesson there too. But it's just that acknowledging, right? People can understand if you can't get to them in that moment. But I've heard you. I know you have a need, and I will be with you when I can.
Well, I've observed teachers in classrooms trying to do that kind of thing, and the way a lot of teachers teach now, they'll have small groups, and when a lot of our teachers teach literacy during their literacy block, they'll have various groups, and the teachers at a group that is the reading center, and they might have a select group of kids, and they're reading a common novel, and they're doing their work. And most teachers have this rule that when I'm at the learning center or the reading center, whatever they call it, I'm not to be disturbed, and they have little, mnemonic devices for kids to remember, if I don't know something, I do this first, then this first, and this first, and, don't see the teacher unless the room's on fire. And some teachers I've seen do this will have little stop signs and things like that. And so if a child does come over and starts asking questions, the teacher, rather than breaking the concentration with the group, will just hold up that little stop sign. And in a way, it's acknowledging, I've heard you, but now's not the time. It may be a little bit abrupt. You can argue that, I suppose. But to your point about being acknowledged, at least if the child's asking over and over and over again, they just want to know that you've heard them. Well, if I hold up the stop sign, I've heard you, but now is not the time to ask. So it's a classroom control thing. How can you do that more restoratively? Rather than holding up a stop sign, I mean, you got to work with your class to talk about those classroom expectations. And let's talk about classroom expectations and what you can do if you have a problem. So that can all be done in a very restorative manner too.
I think it becomes a great topic for a classroom circle to talk about.
Mhm.
I've noticed that when I'm working with a small group over here, that there are a lot of people who want to talk to me, but I can't actually always get there. What are you noticing? And what do you think about that?
Yeah.
And how does that affect you if you're the person asking the question or if you're the person in the small group? And what do you think we can do about this together? Because I don't have to come up with all the solutions as a teacher. It's a class community. So let's throw it back to a conversation about how we're communicating together. And let's use some restorative questions in doing that too.
Yeah.
Because it makes a difference for all the kids, and
Yeah.
especially for the kids that tend to be absent a lot.
And I think of, how could teachers weave the restorative language into what they're already doing? Just essentially not really changing much, just changing the language they use in the questions. And you think of, with kids doing group work and a teacher looks over and some kids don't look like they're doing much. So they walk over and go, are you done? Are you done? And what, as opposed to, guys, tell me what's happening here. You're going to get to the same point, hopefully, but it's less abrupt. It's more restorative. And so sometimes it's just a matter of changing how we ask questions to get to the point rather than making those accusations to kids.
Notice the difference in response of students.
Right.
Because that's going to continue to build your practice when you see that students are responding a different way.
And I've seen teachers actually change the physical arrangement of the furniture in their room so that they're better able to make the eye contact, better able to just acknowledge just a moment, or I'll be there in 2 minutes. That kind of acknowledgement, which goes miles or kilometers to building connections with kids. I'm too busy chasing cows to build a fence. Now, if that sounds like your workplace, make it your intention to use some simple questions like, what happened? This is good for everyone, but particularly good for students on the margins, students who have difficulty attending school. Now, find out more about restorative questions and how to use them in your daily work. at www.restorative.ca. Send me an email, stan@restorative.ca, and let's ask some great questions. And then listen, listen, listen.